Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a throne at the heart of the galaxy. It sits beneath mountains that once scraped the heavens, buried so deep within a palace that stretches across continents that no natural light has touched its surface in 10,000 years. The air around it crackles with energies that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. Thousands of robed figures shuffle through its surrounding corridors in endless procession. They're chanting a low hum that never ceases, not for holidays, not for wars, not for the slow heat death of stars at the edges of known space. And upon that throne sits what remains of a man. His flesh has long since withered to something resembling ancient parchment stretched too thin across a frame too large. His eyes, once said to burn with the light of 1,000 suns, have been dark for millennia. The golden armor that once made him look like a living god has fused with the mechanisms that keep his ruined body from finally surrendering to the death it has been denied for over 10,000 standard years. Cables thicker than a man's torso snake from the throne into the walls and ceiling, pumping energy and sustenance into a form that should have crumbled to dust long, long ago. Every day, without exception, 1,000 psychers are brought before this machine. They are strapped into secondary devices, their screaming mouths locked open, and their life force is slowly drained away to feed the being on the throne. Their souls are consumed like kindling, thrown into a furnace that must never go out. By the time the process is complete, there is nothing left of them, not a body, not a memory, not a whisper in the warp. Just ash and silence and the ever-hungry hum of ancient machinery doing what no one alive truly understands how to maintain. This is the Emperor of mankind, the Master of mankind, the God Emperor of the Imperium, the most powerful psychic being the human race has ever produced, the architect of an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds across the Milky Way galaxy, the father of demigods, the conqueror of terror, the beacon that guides humanity's ships through the howling nightmare of warp space. And he is, for all practical purposes, a corpse that thinks, a corpse that suffers, a corpse that holds the very fabric of human civilization together through nothing more than the sheer, agonizing force of his will. His story is the oldest story in the setting of Warhammer 40,000. It is the story from which every other story flows. At the wars of the Space Marines, the schemes of the Chaos Gods, the Crusades and the heresies and the slow rotting of an empire that was supposed to usher in a golden age for all of humanity. All of it traces back to this one figure. This one impossibly ancient, impossibly powerful, impossibly tragic figure sitting on a golden throne in the dark. And the cruelest part, the detail that elevates this from mere grimdark spectacle into something that genuinely resonates, is this. He never wanted to be a god. He spent thousands of years fighting against superstition and religious devotion. He crushed faiths and burned churches and declared, with absolute certainty, that there were no gods and that humanity's salvation lay in reason and science and the cold light of truth. And now, 10,000 years after his broken body was sealed onto the golden throne, he is worshipped as the one true deity by trillions upon trillions of human beings across the galaxy. The very thing he tried to prevent became the foundation of the civilization built in his name. That is the story we are going to tell tonight. From the very beginning, from the mists of prehistoric Earth, when the first flicker of his consciousness sparked to life, all the way through to the torn and bleeding galaxy of the 41st millennium and beyond, where his shattered empire fights desperately to survive against threats from every direction. This is the rise and fall of the Emperor of mankind. And it begins, as all the greatest tragedies do, with hope. So settle in. Get comfortable. As let the sounds of the world around you fade to something distant and unimportant. Because this story spans tens of thousands of years, and every single one of them matters. The birth of the emperor is shrouded in the kind of deep, impenetrable myth that accumulates around any figure who has been alive for longer than civilizations typically endure. Different sources tell different stories, and in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, that contradiction is actually the point. The lore is deliberately inconsistent, deliberately layered with competing accounts, because the Emperor is a figure so old and so powerful that the truth about him has been worn smooth by the passage of time, like a river stone that no longer bears any resemblance to the jagged rock it once was. But there is one account that has persisted longer than most. That it comes from the oldest sources in the lore, the Realm of Chaos books published in the late 1980s, and while Games Workshop has moved somewhat away from treating it as absolute canon, it remains the most commonly referenced origin story for the Emperor among the fan community, and continues to influence how the character is written. In the earliest millennia of human civilization, when the first settlements along the great rivers of Mesopotamia and Anatolia were just beginning to take shape, there existed among humanity a scattered population of individuals who possessed psychic abilities. These were the shamans. They were the wise ones, the seers, the healers, and spirit walkers of their respective tribes and peoples, and they possessed a remarkable gift that set them apart from ordinary humans. When they died, their souls did not simply dissolve into the churning energies of the warp. Instead, they could reincarnate. Their consciousness would pass through the immaterial realm and return to the physical world in a new body, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom and power of their previous lives. For ages beyond counting, this cycle continued. Shamans died and were reborn, growing more powerful with each iteration. They served as the quiet guardians of their people, guiding humanity through the long, dark stretches of its earliest history with a gentle hand and a watchful eye. But as the millennia passed, something began to change in the warp. The psychic dimension that exists alongside and beneath physical reality was growing darker. The emotions of sentient beings throughout the galaxy were feeding nascent entities of enormous and terrible power, beings that would eventually become known as the Chaos Gods. And these growing presences began to prey upon the souls of the shamans as they passed through the warp during their cycle of reincarnation. Where once the journey between death and rebirth had been safe, it was now fraught with danger. Shamans who died found their souls being devoured by hungry entities that lurked in the immaterial darkness, waiting with infinite patience for their next meal. The shamans recognized the danger. They understood, with the clarity that comes from thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, that if nothing was done, they would eventually be consumed entirely. The guardians of humanity would be destroyed, and the species would be left defenseless against the growing horrors of the warp. And so they made a decision. A terrible, desperate, beautiful decision. They would pool their power. Every shaman alive, thousands of them from every corner of the ancient world, would end their own lives simultaneously in a coordinated act of mass self-sacrifice. Their souls would rush into the warp together, a tidal wave of psychic energy so vast and so concentrated that the warp predators could not consume them all. And from that incredible convergence of spiritual power, a single soul would be forged. A new consciousness, carrying within it the combined knowledge, wisdom, and psychic might of every shaman who had ever lived. This being was called the New Man. According to the oldest lore, yet this ritual of mass suicide and spiritual rebirth took place sometime in the 8th millennium before the Common Era, in the region of central Anatolia, in what would later become the nation of Turkey. A child was born to a family of Neolithic farmers along the banks of the Sakarya River. An ordinary birth by all outward appearances, but within that infant's tiny frame burned a soul of extraordinary magnitude. The collective consciousness of thousands of shamans fused into a single being of unprecedented psychic power. The child grew, and as he grew, his abilities manifested. He could sense the thoughts and emotions of those around him. He could peer into the currents of the warp and glimpse fragments of possible futures. He could move objects with his mind and influence the behavior of living creatures. By any standard of the time, he was a miracle or a monster, depending on who was watching. One particular moment from his childhood has been referenced in the lore as a defining event. His father was murdered by his uncle. While the boy was preparing his father's body for burial, he experienced a psychic vision of the murder itself, seeing clearly through the veil of time to witness the act of betrayal. And then, with a calm that would become characteristic of his approach to problems throughout the millennia to come, the boy walked to where his uncle stood and simply stopped the man's heart with his mind. No anger, no visible effort, just a quiet application of will and a life extinguished. According to the Emperor himself, this was the moment he understood that humanity needed guidance. That left to their own devices, now humans would destroy each other with the same casual cruelty his uncle had displayed. They needed law, they needed order, they needed someone who could see further and think more clearly than any ordinary person. Someone who could steer the species away from the cliffs it seemed determined to march toward. Whether this account is self-serving justification for the autocratic rule he would eventually impose, or a genuine moment of moral clarity experienced by a being unlike any other in human history, is a question the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. The boy did not mourn. He did not weep. He simply looked at his uncle's body and understood, with the kind of clarity that most people never achieve in an entire lifetime, that the world was broken. That humans, left to their own nature, would continue to commit acts of senseless violence against one another until there was no one left. That someone, somewhere, had to step in and impose a structure, a set of rules, a guiding hand that could steer the species away from self-destruction. Whether this was genuine moral insight or the first stirring of a messiah complex that would eventually encompass an entire galaxy is one of those questions the lore invites you to ask but never fully answers. The Emperor, across all the various accounts of his life, exists in a state of deliberate moral ambiguity. He is simultaneously the greatest hero humanity has ever produced and one of the most terrifyingly ruthless individuals who has ever lived. And both of those things are true at the same time, because in the universe of Warhammer 40,000, the line between heroism and tyranny is often invisible until it has already been crossed. After this defining moment, the boy left his village and walked toward the first great cities of human civilization. Where exactly he went is lost to time, though ancient Sumeria is the most commonly suggested destination. He would have been impossibly young by the standards of any culture to undertake such a journey alone, but then again, he was not like other children. He was not like anyone who had ever lived. The combined wisdom and power of thousands of shamans burned in his blood, driving him forward with a purpose that transcended anything so mundane as personal ambition or fear. And from that point forward, the being who would eventually become the Emperor of mankind vanished from the visible record of human history. Not because he ceased to exist, but because he chose to exist in the shadows. He became a phantom, a recurring figure who appeared at the margins of great events, nudged the course of civilization in subtle ways, and then disappeared before anyone could question who he was or where he had come from. For roughly 40,000 years, the Emperor walked among humanity without revealing himself. Think about that number for a moment. 40,000 years. That is an almost inconceivable span of time. The entirety of recorded human history, from the first crude markings on clay tablets to the moon landings and beyond, represents only a tiny sliver of the time the Emperor spent quietly observing and occasionally nudging the course of human events. He adopted countless identities across the millennia. He lived as kings and scholars, and as warriors and philosophers, as humble peasants and powerful warlords. Some accounts in the lore hint that he may have been Alexander the Great, the golden-armored conqueror who wept because he believed there were no more worlds to conquer. There is a story, presented in the Horus Heresy novel The Last Church by Graham McNeill, that suggests the Emperor may have been the historical figure behind the legend of St. George, a golden knight who slew a silver dragon. This connection is particularly compelling because we know from the lore that the Emperor fought and defeated the Void Dragon, one of the godlike energy beings known as the Satan, supposedly imprisoning its physical form somewhere beneath the surface of Mars. A golden knight, a silver dragon. The parallels are hard to ignore, but for the most part, and the Emperor remained hidden, a ghost haunting the corridors of history. He watched civilizations rise and fall. He witnessed the flowering of art and philosophy, and the equally spectacular flowering of cruelty and war. He saw humanity reach for the stars and achieve wonders that would seem like magic to earlier generations, the period known in 40K lore as the Dark Age of technology. During this golden era, humanity spread across the galaxy, colonizing world after world, building a civilization of breathtaking sophistication and power. Artificial intelligences called the Men of Iron served human masters. The Men of Stone, beings of uncertain nature, helped build the infrastructure of an interstellar empire. Humanity reached a level of technological achievement that would never be matched again, and then it all fell apart. The rebellion of the Men of Iron against their human creators precipitated a catastrophic war that shattered the galactic civilization humanity had built. The artificial intelligences turned on their makers with the cold efficiency of machines that no longer saw any reason to serve. The war was devastating, and even after humanity eventually prevailed, the damage was irreparable. Trust in artificial intelligence was destroyed. Vast swathes of technological knowledge were lost. And then came something worse. Warp storms of unprecedented ferocity began to sweep across the galaxy. These were the birth pangs of the fourth chaos god, Slaanesh, whose emergence was being catalyzed by the slow, decadent collapse of the Eldar civilization on the other side of the galaxy. As the Eldar's excesses grew more extreme, as the turbulence in the warp intensified, cutting off interstellar travel and communication between human-settled worlds. Colony after colony was left isolated, cut off from the wider civilization they had been part of, forced to fend for themselves against whatever dangers lurked in their particular corner of space. This period became known as the Age of Strife, or Old Night. It lasted for approximately 5,000 years, and it reduced humanity from a galaxy-spanning civilization to a collection of scattered, desperate survivors clinging to whatever worlds they could hold. On many planets, technology regressed to pre-industrial levels. On others, populations were enslaved or exterminated by alien species that took advantage of humanity's weakness. Worlds that had once been jewels of civilization became feral wastelands where the descendants of scientists and artists lived as cave-dwelling hunters, the knowledge of their ancestors lost entirely within a handful of generations. The suffering during the Age of Strife is difficult to overstate. On some worlds, the warp storms did not merely disrupt travel and communication, they warped reality itself, allowing demons to manifest in the physical world and prey upon human populations that had no understanding of what they were facing. Entire civilizations were consumed by chaos from within, their people corrupted and twisted into monstrous parodies of what they had once been. On other worlds, human psychers, their numbers swelling as humanity's psychic potential slowly evolved, became unwitting conduits for demonic possession. Their uncontrolled powers tearing holes in the fabric of reality and allowing the horrors of the warp to spill through. The result was a galaxy-wide nightmare that lasted for 50 centuries, an era so dark and so terrible that the memory of it would haunt humanity for tens of thousands of years to come. And on Terra itself, the birth world of the species, civilization collapsed into a nightmare of warlords and techno-barbarian kingdoms, fighting endlessly over the irradiated ruins of what had once been the seat of a galactic empire. The great cities crumbled, the oceans were poisoned, the atmosphere was choked with the residue of weapons that should never have been used. The people who survived did so through brutality, cunning, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to see another sunrise. Terra became a death world, Us not because of any natural hazard, but because its inhabitants had made it one through millennia of unrelenting warfare. Throughout all of this, the Emperor watched and waited. He could not act, not yet. The warp storms made interstellar travel impossible, trapping even a being of his power on a single world. But he could see, through his prescient visions, that the storms would eventually subside. He could sense the approaching moment when the elder civilization would finally destroy itself in the catastrophic psychic event known as the Fall, birthing Slaanesh into full existence, but also, paradoxically, calming the warp storms that had been generated by the process. When that moment came, interstellar travel would become possible again, and when it did, he intended to be ready. During those long millennia of waiting, the Emperor was not idle. He continued to develop his psychic abilities, pushing the boundaries of what even a being of his extraordinary power could achieve. He studied the warp, seeking to understand its currents and the entities that dwelt within it. He gathered allies, quietly identifying individuals of exceptional talent and dedication, who could serve as the foundation of the armies and institutions he would eventually need. And he planned. With the patience of a being who had already waited for tens of thousands of years, he crafted a design for humanity's future so vast and so intricate that no single mortal mind could comprehend more than a fraction of its scope. He was also, during this time, an immortal perpetual, a member of a rare and poorly understood subset of humanity that possessed the ability to regenerate from virtually any injury, including death itself. Other perpetuals existed, scattered across the galaxy, and some of them knew the Emperor and interacted with him during various periods of history. These interactions hint at a side of the Emperor that is rarely seen in the grand narrative of the setting, the personal side, the individual who had relationships and conversations and moments of vulnerability that were erased by the passage of time and the construction of myth. The perpetual known as Erda would become particularly important to the Emperor's story, as she would eventually play a role in the creation and scattering of the Primarchs. It was during the Dark Age of technology, long before the Age of Strife began, that the Emperor undertook what may be the most consequential journey of his entire existence. Together with several of his fellow perpetuals, immortal beings who shared his gift of effective immortality through rapid cellular regeneration, he traveled to a world called Molech. Molech was a lush, green world, home to noble houses of imperial knights and a population that lived in relative comfort compared to many other human-settled planets. But beneath its surface lay something far more significant than any human settlement. Hidden deep underground was a gateway, a portal that led directly into the realm of chaos, the dimension of raw psychic energy that exists alongside physical reality and is home to the 4 chaos gods and their infinite legions of demons. The Emperor did not stumble upon this gate by accident. He knew it was there, and he traveled to Molech specifically to use it. What happened when he stepped through that portal and into the swirling madness of the warp is one of the most debated and discussed pieces of lore in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. The details are deliberately obscured, filtered through unreliable narrators and contradictory accounts, but the broad strokes are generally consistent. The Emperor entered the realm of chaos and, according to most sources, made some manner of bargain with the Chaos Gods. The nature of this bargain is unknown. It may have involved knowledge or power, or some combination of both. What we do know is that when the Emperor emerged from the warp gate on Molech, he was fundamentally changed. He possessed knowledge and abilities he had not had before. Specifically, he now had the understanding necessary to create beings of extraordinary psychic and physical power, beings that would combine the techniques of advanced genetic science with the raw energies of the warp itself. He had the knowledge to create the Primarchs. Now, it is absolutely critical to understand the debate surrounding this event. The claim that the Emperor made a bargain with the Chaos Gods comes primarily from sources within the lore that are, to put it mildly, not entirely trustworthy. Demons told this story to Horus. Lorgar and Erebus, two of the most thoroughly corrupted traitors in human history, spread versions of this account. The Chaos Gods themselves have every reason to portray the Emperor as someone who owes them a debt, because that narrative serves their purposes. Many scholars of the lore argue, persuasively, that the Emperor did not gain his power from the Chaos Gods because he was already their equal or superior in psychic might long before he ever went to Molech. He was already known to the Chaos Gods as the Anathema, the being whose very existence represented the opposite of everything they stood for. It seems unlikely in the extreme that they would willingly empower such a being. The more accepted interpretation is that the Emperor obtained knowledge, not power, from his journey through the warp gate, specifically the knowledge of how to imbue living beings with warp energy in a controlled and directed fashion, a technique that would be essential for the creation of the Primarchs. Others suggest the entire Molech incident may have been a trap laid by the Emperor for whoever might eventually follow in his footsteps. When Horus, during the heresy, eventually found his way to Molech and passed through the same warp gate, he emerged convinced that he had gained the same power his father had, and in a sense, he had. But the power the Chaos Gods offered came with chains attached, chains that Horus could not see until it was far too late. Whether the Emperor truly made a Faustian bargain with the dark powers of the warp, or whether he simply stole knowledge from them in a daring cosmic heist, or whether the entire affair was a calculated gambit with consequences he foresaw and accepted, the result was the same. The Emperor now possessed everything he needed to begin the next phase of his grand plan for humanity's future. He left one of his fellow perpetuals, a woman named Olivia Soreka, behind on Molech to guard the warp gate. And then he returned to Terra to prepare for what was to come. The Emperor arrived back on Molech in a starship, but according to the lore, he returned to Terra without one. How exactly an immortal psychic being of godlike power traveled across interstellar distances without a ship is left as one of the many tantalizing mysteries surrounding his nature. Some of his fellow perpetuals demonstrated the ability to teleport across vast distances through means that are never fully explained. It is reasonable to assume the Emperor could do the same, and far more besides. With the knowledge gained at Molech secured in his mind, the Emperor retreated to his laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of Terra. There, in vast subterranean complexes carved from the living rock, he began the work that would ultimately define the fate of humanity. But that work would take time, decades, centuries, and in the meantime, the age of strife raged on, and Terra continued to tear itself apart. By the end of the 29th millennium, Terra had been consumed by anarchy for thousands of years. The once proud homeworld of humanity was a scarred and irradiated wasteland, divided among dozens of techno-barbarian kingdoms, city-states, and petty empires that fought ceaselessly over the planet's dwindling resources. The very air was poisoned by millennia of chemical and nuclear warfare. The population had been mutated by generations of exposure to lingering radiation and biological weapons. The sophisticated civilization that had once graced Terra's surface was nothing more than a fading memory, as its ruins picked over by warlords who understood nothing of the technology they scavenged and used only the crudest applications of the weapons they found. It was into this nightmare that the Emperor finally chose to reveal himself. The timing was not accidental. The Emperor possessed the gift of foresight, the ability to peer into the currents of the warp and discern the shape of possible futures. He could sense that the fall of the Eldar was approaching, that cataclysmic event that would birth Slanesh and simultaneously calm the warp storms that had isolated humanity's scattered worlds for 5,000 years. When those storms subsided, interstellar travel would become possible again, and the Emperor intended to be the one standing at the head of a unified Terra when that happened, ready to reach out to the stars and gather the lost fragments of humanity back into a single civilization. But first, he needed an army, in secret laboratories beneath the mountains. The Emperor had been developing his first generation of genetically engineered super soldiers. These were the Thunder Warriors, and they were magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Created through a combination of alchemical augmentation, somatic gene sculpting, and muscle grafting techniques, the Thunder Warriors were faster, stronger, and more resilient than any normal human. They towered over ordinary soldiers, their bodies packed with enhanced muscle and reinforced bone. They were built for one purpose: conquest. Specifically, the conquest of terror. But the Thunder Warriors were flawed. They were created from adult male recruits rather than the adolescent candidates who would later be used to create Space Marines. And the augmentation process was cruder, less refined, less stable. Many Thunder Warriors suffered from mental instability. Their enhanced bodies had a tendency to degrade over time, the genetic modifications breaking down and causing cascading organ failures that could turn a mighty warrior into a convulsing wreck without warning. They were weapons designed for a specific purpose, and like all weapons designed for a specific purpose, they had a limited shelf life. Alongside the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor also created his personal bodyguard, the Custodian Guard. These warriors were something different entirely. Where the Thunder Warriors were mass-produced soldiers, crude but effective, the Custodes were individual masterpieces, each one handcrafted by the Emperor himself, through a process so complex and personalized that no two were exactly alike. They were the Emperor's companions, his protectors, his closest servants, and unlike the Thunder Warriors, they were stable. Their genetic enhancements did not degrade. They did not suffer from mental instability. They were, in many ways, a preview of what the Emperor could achieve when he applied his full genius to the creation of superhuman warriors. With his Thunder Warriors at his back and his Custodes at his side, the Emperor emerged from the shadows and began the Unification Wars. The wars to unify Terra were a long, brutal, and comprehensive campaign that lasted for decades and consumed the entire planet. The Emperor did not simply defeat his enemies. He systematically dismantled every power structure on Terra that was not his own, using a combination of military force, diplomacy, propaganda, and sheer psychic intimidation to bring the fractured world to heal. Some of the techno-barbarian kingdoms fell quickly. The Achaemenid Empire, located in what had once been Persia, swore allegiance to the Emperor early in the conflict and was spared the worst of the fighting. Their genomes were relatively uncontaminated by the mutations that plagued other populations, making them valuable candidates for future recruitment into the Emperor's new armies. Others fought with desperate ferocity. The realm of Ursh, the mightiest of the techno-barbarian empires, controlled the vast steppes of what had once been Russia and Central Asia. Under the tyrant Caligan, as Ursh employed powerful psychic witches and wielded dangerous warp powers against the Emperor's forces, the fighting was savage and prolonged, but Caligan was eventually defeated and killed. The Pan-Pacific Empire, under the self-proclaimed tyrant Nathan Doom, fielded formidable armies of its own, but was ultimately broken by imperial forces consisting of Thunder Warriors, Caucasian levies, and hired mercenaries. The Ethnarchy was perhaps the most dangerous opponent the Emperor faced during the Unification Wars. They commanded genetically modified warriors called the Cassis, possessed dangerous weapons recovered from the Dark Age of technology, and employed enslaved psykers as weapons of war. The first imperial attempt to capture the Ethnarchy's strongholds cost the lives of 20,000 Thunder Warriors and 1 million other casualties. It was not until later in the wars, when the Emperor was able to deploy his first Space Marine legions, that the Ethnarchy was finally crushed. And then there was Albia. Old Albia, with its soot-blackened fortress cities and its ancient warlike clans. The Albians were stubborn, proud, and phenomenally well-armed. They met the Emperor's Thunder Warriors with their own steam-powered proto-dreadnoughts and armored Ironside soldiers, and battle after battle, they held their ground, inflicting staggering casualties on the attackers. The Emperor, recognizing the quality of his opponent, called a ceasefire, and tried something different. He appeared before the Albion clan lords unarmed, all dressed in white and crimson, and spoke to them not as a conqueror, but as a visionary. He told them of his dream of a unified humanity, of glory among the stars, and redemption from the darkness of the age of strife. And to the shock of nearly everyone, the warlords of Albia accepted. They knelt before the emperor and became some of the most zealous supporters of unification. Many of the early Space Marine recruits would come from Albion stock. Throughout the unification wars, the emperor was accompanied by a figure who would become one of the most important individuals in the history of the Imperium, Malcador the Sigillite, an extraordinarily powerful psyker in his own right. Malcador served as the emperor's chief advisor, administrator, and confidant. It was Malcador, according to the law, but who convinced the being known simply as the Warlord to adopt the title of emperor. It was Malcador who helped shape the bureaucratic and administrative structures that would eventually grow into the vast machinery of imperial governance. And it would be Malcador who would make the ultimate sacrifice at the very end, when everything the emperor had built came crashing down around him. The unification wars culminated in the Battle of Mount Ararat, fought in the territory of the Kingdom of Urartu, the last techno-barbarian state to resist the emperor's rule. The imperial chronicles record that during this final battle, the remaining Thunder Warriors were slain to a man by the enemy. The famous Thunder Warrior, Arik Taranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, he supposedly raised the banner of lightning at the final declaration of unity before dying of his wounds. But the truth, as is so often the case in this setting, was darker than the official record. The Thunder Warriors were not killed by the enemy at Mount Ararat. They were secretly purged on the Emperor's own orders. Their purpose had been served. Terra was unified, and now their instability, their mental degradation, their tendency toward violence and psychosis made them a liability rather than an asset. The Emperor needed them gone to make way for the next generation of his superhuman creations, the Space Marines, who would be more stable, more controllable, and better suited for the long campaigns of interstellar conquest that lay ahead. This is one of the first and clearest demonstrations of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Emperor's story. He was willing to make terrible, seemingly cruel decisions in pursuit of what he believed was the greater good. The Thunder Warriors served him faithfully and fought with extraordinary courage for his vision of a unified humanity. And when they were no longer useful, he had them killed and replaced, not out of malice, but out of cold, calculated pragmatism, the kind of pragmatism that could save a species and damn a soul in the same breath. With Terra unified and the Thunder Warriors consigned to history, the Emperor turned his attention to the stars. But before he could reach for the galaxy, he needed to complete the project that would give him the tools to conquer it. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in laboratories so secret that even his closest allies were not fully aware of their extent, the Emperor had been working on his masterpiece. The Primarch project was the culmination of everything the Emperor had learned across tens of thousands of years of existence. It combined the most advanced techniques of genetic engineering available to human science with the arcane knowledge of warp manipulation he had obtained during his journey through the Molech Gate. The goal was nothing less than the creation of 20 superhuman beings, each one embodying a different aspect of the Emperor's own formidable capabilities, each one designed to serve as a general, a diplomat, a leader, and a symbol for the armies that would reconquer the galaxy in humanity's name. The Primarchs were grown in artificial gestation capsules in the Emperor's gene laboratories, beneath what would become the Imperial Palace. Each one was crafted from the Emperor's own genetic material, modified and specialized to emphasize particular traits. One would be the greatest strategist ever to draw breath. Another would embody the terror of war itself. A third would master the psychic arts to a degree surpassed only by the Emperor. A fourth would be the supreme architect of fortification and defense. And so on, through all 20, each one a unique expression of some facet of the Emperor's vision for how the galaxy should be conquered and governed.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just give you my honest take on this, because this part of the story always gets me. The Emperor's biggest flaw was never his power or his ambition, it was that he couldn't be vulnerable with the people who needed it most. He built 20 sons and treated them like employees, and I think that hits different because we have all known someone like that. Maybe a parent, maybe a boss, someone brilliant who just could not figure out how to say, I need you, instead of, I require your service. That gap between genius and emotional intelligence is what broke the Imperium. Not chaos, not demons, just a father who couldn't tell his kids he loved them. But anyways, that's just my take on it. Let's go back to the video.
But the Emperor's creations were not merely physical. To elevate the Primarchs beyond what even the most advanced genetic engineering could achieve, as the Emperor infused them with energies drawn from the warp. This was the knowledge he had gained at Molech, the ability to bind psychic power into living flesh in a controlled and directed fashion. It was this warp enhancement that gave the Primarchs their extraordinary charisma, their almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those around them, their capacity to perform feats that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But warp energy is not a tame force. It cannot be bottled and directed without consequences. And by infusing the Primarchs with the power of the Imperium, the Emperor had, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps as an accepted risk, made them susceptible to the influences of the beings that dwelt within it. The Chaos Gods could sense the Primarchs, they could feel the warp energy flowing through them, and they recognized both the threat these beings represented and the opportunity they presented. The Chaos Gods struck before the Primarchs could be born. Breaking through the wards the Emperor had erected around his gene laboratories, they snatched the 20 gestation capsules and scattered them through the warp, flinging each one to a different, distant world across the galaxy. The Emperor's masterwork, decades or centuries in the making, was undone in a single catastrophic moment. Some accounts suggest that the scattering was not entirely the work of the Chaos Gods alone. The perpetual known as Erda, who had worked alongside the Emperor in the creation of the Primarchs, may have played a role. According to certain sources, Erda deliberately allowed or even facilitated the scattering, and believing that the Emperor intended to use the Primarchs as tools rather than raise them as sons, and hoping that if they were raised among ordinary people on ordinary worlds, they might develop the humanity that she feared the Emperor's cold pragmatism would have denied them. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. 20 superhuman infants were deposited on 20 different worlds, separated from their creator and from each other by the vast gulfs of interstellar space. Each one grew up in radically different circumstances. Some were raised in luxury, adopted by ruling families who recognized the extraordinary nature of the child in their care. Others were raised in poverty or slavery, or the brutal conditions of hostile death worlds, where survival itself was a daily struggle. And every single one of them matured with astonishing speed, reaching adult size within their first few years of life and demonstrating genius-level intellect from the moment they could speak. They were not merely children, they were Primarchs, and the worlds that harbored them would never be the same. The Emperor was devastated by the loss of his Primarchs, but he was not the kind of being who allowed setbacks to derail his plans. The genetic material from each Primarch had been sampled before the scattering, and from those samples, the Emperor and his scientists developed the gene seed, the set of genetically engineered organs that, when implanted into a suitable human host, would transform that host into a superhuman warrior modeled on the Primarch from whom the gene seed was derived. These warriors were the Space Marines. It and they would become the backbone of the Emperor's military for the great crusade that was to come. The Space Marines were not as powerful as the Primarchs. They were smaller, weaker, less psychically gifted, but they were far more numerous, and they were remarkably effective soldiers. Organized into 20 legions, each one tied to a specific Primarch through the gene seed they carried, the Space Marines combined superhuman physical abilities with rigorous training, advanced weaponry, and the kind of fanatical dedication to duty that only beings who had been literally designed for war could display. With the legions assembled and the Great Crusade about to begin, the Emperor also created the Astronomicon, a supremely powerful psychic beacon powered by his own will and the life energies of a choir of 10,000 psychers. This beacon would reach across the galaxy, providing a navigational reference point for ships traveling through the warp. Without it, long-distance warp travel was impossibly dangerous. With it, the Emperor's fleets could reach any corner of the galaxy in relative safety. Everything was in place. The armies were built. The beacon was lit. The warp storms that had isolated humanity's scattered worlds for 5,000 years were beginning to subside as the fall of the Eldar finally played itself out. The age of strife was ending, and the Emperor of mankind, at the head of the mightiest military force the galaxy had ever seen, set his gaze upon the stars and prepared to conquer them. The Great Crusade began approximately in the year 798 of the 30th millennium. Its opening move was the first pacification of Luna, Terra's moon, which had fallen under the control of hostile forces during the Age of Strife. With Luna secured, the Emperor turned his attention to the rest of the Sol system, liberating the human settlements on Mars, Saturn, Neptune, and Jupiter from alien overlords and hostile factions. The alliance with Mars was arguably the single most important diplomatic achievement of the entire crusade. Mars was the domain of the Mechanicum, a civilization of tech priests who worshipped the machine god and possessed the most advanced manufacturing capabilities in the known galaxy. Their forges could produce the ships, weapons, armor, and equipment that the Emperor's armies desperately needed. But the Mechanicum was also deeply religious, their entire society organized around the veneration of technology as a form of divine expression. The Emperor, and who had spent the Unification Wars stamping out religious belief wherever he found it, could have tried to conquer Mars by force. But even with his Thunder Warriors and the early Space Marine legions, such a war would have been extraordinarily costly. The Mechanicum had Titan legions, god machines that stood as tall as buildings and carried weapons capable of leveling cities. They had the manufacturing capacity of an entire planet geared toward war production. Fighting them would have been madness, so instead, the Emperor negotiated. He signed the Treaty of Mars, also known as the Treaty of Olympus Mons, which established an alliance between Terra and Mars. The Mechanicum would retain their religious practices and a significant degree of autonomy. In exchange, they would provide the ships, weapons, and logistical support needed for the Great Crusade. It was a compromise, and the Emperor was not typically a man given to compromise. But it was a necessary one, and it demonstrates that for all his power and vision, the Emperor understood that sometimes pragmatism had to take precedence over principle. With Mars on board, the infrastructure for galactic conquest was in place. The Mechanicum's forge worlds churned out warships and weapons at a staggering rate. The Space Marine legions, numbering in the hundreds of thousands and growing, were equipped with the finest arms and armor human technology could produce. And the Astronomicon blazed its psychic light across the galaxy, a lighthouse in the darkness that would guide the Emperor's fleets to their destinations. The Great Crusade expanded outward from Terra in waves. Expeditionary fleets, each typically built around a core of Space Marines, supplemented by vast numbers of regular human soldiers from the Imperial Army, Titan legions, and other supporting forces, pushed into the galaxy in every direction. They discovered lost human colonies and brought them into the Imperium, sometimes through diplomacy, but often through force. They encountered alien civilizations and, with very few exceptions, destroyed them. The Emperor had decreed that the galaxy belonged to humanity, and any species that stood in the way of human expansion was to be eliminated or driven into exile. At its height, the Great Crusade fielded over 4,300 separate expeditionary fleets. The scale of the enterprise was almost beyond comprehension. Thousands upon thousands of worlds were brought into compliance, their populations integrated into the growing Imperium, their resources harnessed to fuel the ongoing expansion. It was the greatest military campaign in the history of the galaxy, and at its center stood the Emperor, directing the whole vast enterprise with a strategic vision that spanned not just the stars, but the centuries. And as the crusade pushed deeper into the galaxy, the Emperor began to find his lost sons. Horus Lupercal was the first Primarch to be rediscovered. He had been raised on Chthoniya, a mining world relatively close to Terra, where he had grown up amid vicious gang warfare and the brutal hierarchy of a world where strength was the only currency that mattered. Despite these harsh beginnings, Horus had thrived. He was charismatic, intelligent, and possessed of a natural authority that drew others to him effortlessly. As when the Emperor found him, the bond between father and son was almost immediate. Horus was given command of the 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves, and quickly proved himself to be one of the most gifted military commanders the Imperium had ever seen. One by one, the other Primarchs were found. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, raised among the fierce tribes of the frozen death world Fenris. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian, who had built an empire spanning multiple star systems from his adoptive homeworld of Inwit. Sanguinius, the Angel, beloved by all who beheld him, whose magnificent wings and luminous presence made him seem like something out of myth rather than reality. Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk, who had united the warring tribes of Chagoris through speed, cunning, and ferocity. Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes, and a gentle giant who had protected the people of volcanic Nocturne from the monstrous creatures that plagued their world. Each Primarch brought their own unique genius to the crusade. Each one reshaped their legion in their own image, instilling in their space marines the particular martial traditions, philosophies, and cultural values they had absorbed on their adoptive homeworlds. The diversity of approaches was one of the Crusade's greatest strengths. Where Horus excelled at flexible, adaptive warfare, Rogel Dawn was the supreme master of fortification and defense. Where Leman Russ brought savage fury, Robut Gilliman brought meticulous organization and logistical brilliance. Where Conrad Kurz wielded terror as a weapon, Sanguinius inspired through beauty and nobility. The discovery of each Primarch was a unique story, and some of these reunions left scars that would never fully heal. Angron of the World Eaters was found on the world of Nuceria, where he had been captured and fitted with psychosurgical implants called the Butcher's Nails that flooded his brain with aggression and pain. When the Emperor found him, Angron was leading a slave rebellion against his oppressors, fighting alongside the gladiators who had become his brothers in chains. Angron wanted to fight and die with his fellow slaves. The Emperor, unwilling to lose one of his Primarchs in a battle he considered strategically insignificant, teleported Angron away from the battlefield against his will, leaving his comrades to die without him. Angron never forgave the Emperor for this. The bitterness of that forced rescue, the memory of brothers abandoned to die so that a father's plans could continue unimpeded, festered in Angron's damaged mind for decades. When the heresy came, Angron's choice was already made. Mortarion of the Death Guard was found on the toxic death world of Barbarus, a place of perpetual fog and poison where human settlers lived in the lowland valleys while monstrous alien overlords ruled from the high peaks. Mortarion had spent his life fighting these overlords, building an army from the suffering people of Barbarus, and slowly pushing higher and higher into the poisonous atmosphere that the alien masters breathed as easily as Mortarion breathed clean air. When the Emperor arrived, Mortarion was on the verge of assaulting the final fortress of the High Overlord Neker, the most powerful of the alien tyrants. Yet the Emperor challenged Mortarion to complete the task alone, promising that if the Primarch could slay Neker without help, he would leave Barbarus in peace. Mortarion tried. He climbed higher than any human had ever gone on Barbarus, breathing air that would have killed a normal man in seconds, fighting through the aliens' defenses with the desperate fury of a man who had everything to prove. But the toxins were too much even for a Primarch. Mortarion collapsed, choking, failing, within sight of Nekara's fortress, but unable to reach it. The Emperor stepped in and killed the Overlord himself. Mortarion was saved, but his pride was shattered. He had been robbed of his victory, his life's purpose stolen from him by a father who had set him up to fail. That wound never healed either. Even the discoveries that went well carried complications. Lorgar Aurelian of the Word-Bearers was found on the feudal world of Colchis, where he had risen to become a beloved religious leader, a prophet who preached about the coming of a golden god from the stars. When the emperor arrived, Lorgar's faith seemed vindicated. Here was the god he had prophesied. The joy of that reunion was genuine and deep, but it planted the seed of a conflict that would eventually shatter the Imperium, because the emperor did not want worship. He wanted obedience. Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns was found on the world of Prospero, where he had built a civilization of scholar sorcerers who explored the boundaries of psychic power with an enthusiasm that bordered on recklessness. Magnus was a prodigious psyker, perhaps the most gifted of all the Primarchs in the psychic arts, and his reunion with the Emperor was marked by a shared intellectual curiosity and mutual respect. But the Emperor also recognized the danger in Magnus's approach to the warp. The Primarch treated the Imperium as a tool to be mastered, when in reality, it was a predatory dimension that preyed upon anyone foolish enough to believe they could control it. The Emperor's attempts to restrain Magnus's use of psychic powers would eventually drive a wedge between them, with catastrophic consequences. But the diversity also bred rivalry. The Primarchs were not merely generals. They were demigods, each one possessed of an ego and sense of purpose as vast as the galaxy they were conquering. Friendly competition between brothers gradually sharpened into something more dangerous as the decades of the Crusade wore on. As Leman Russ clashed with both Angron and Lionel Johnson, Perturabo simmered with resentment toward Rogel Dawn, whose legion was given the honor of fortifying the imperial palace on Terra, while Perturabo's iron warriors were sent to grind through the most thankless and inglorious sieges the Crusade had to offer. Conrad Kurzer, haunted by visions of a future where his own father would condemn him, grew increasingly erratic and violent. The Emperor, for his part, seemed to regard his sons with a mixture of genuine affection and cold pragmatism that many of them found deeply unsettling. He loved them in his way. But his way was the way of a being who had lived for tens of thousands of years and who viewed the universe through the lens of plans that spanned millennia. To the Emperor, the Primarchs were his greatest creations, his most powerful tools, his most effective instruments for shaping the future of humanity. That he also felt something resembling fatherly pride when they succeeded, and something resembling fatherly disappointment when they failed, did not change the fundamental dynamic. They were, in the end, means to an end, and some of them sensed this, and it ate at them. The apex of the Great Crusade came with the Ullanor Crusade, a massive campaign against the largest concentration of Orc power the Imperium had yet encountered. The Greenskin Empire, centered on the world of Ullanor, was vast and powerful, its forces numbering in the billions, led by an Orc warlord of terrifying size and ferocity. The Emperor himself led the assault, fighting alongside his sons in one of the last great battles he would personally wage. And the victory at Ullanor was total and devastating. The Orc Empire was shattered, its warlords slain, its forces scattered to the winds. And in the aftermath, at the grand celebration known as the Triumph of Ullanor, the Emperor made an announcement that would change the course of galactic history. He was leaving the Great Crusade. The Emperor's announcement at the Triumph of Ullanor sent shockwaves through the entire Imperium. For over a century, the Master of Mankind had been the personal leader of the greatest military campaign in human history. His presence on the front lines had been a constant source of inspiration for the millions of soldiers who fought in his name. And now he was withdrawing from the field, returning to Terra to pursue a secret project that he refused to explain even to his most trusted sons. Before leaving, the Emperor elevated Horus Lupercal to the rank of War Master, Supreme Commander of all Imperial military forces. It was the highest honor ever bestowed upon a mortal being. Horus would speak with the Emperor's voice and command with the Emperor's authority. The other Primarchs were instructed to defer to their brother in all matters military and to continue the Great Crusade under his leadership until the galaxy was fully conquered. The reaction among the Primarchs was mixed. Some, like Sanguinius and the Khan, accepted the decision with grace. Others were less sanguine. Robuta Guilliman, while outwardly supportive, quietly harbored concerns about the concentration of so much power in a single Primarch's hands. Lion L. Johnson felt slighted that he had not been considered for the role. Angron, who cared nothing for titles and politics, and simply continued his endless cycle of violence and destruction without comment. And some, like Lorgar Aurelian of the Wordbearers, saw the Emperor's departure as something far more troubling. Lorgar was a special case among the Primarchs. Where his brothers excelled at warfare, Lorgar's genius was spiritual. He was a preacher, a prophet, a builder of cathedrals, and a writer of scriptures. He loved the Emperor with a fervor that went beyond loyalty or respect. He worshipped the Emperor as a god, and on the world of Khur, in a city called Monarchia, Lorgar had built what he considered a perfect expression of that devotion, a city so beautiful and so thoroughly dedicated to the Emperor's glory that it seemed to glow with an inner light. The Emperor destroyed Monarchia. He sent the Ultramarines to level the city, and then he came to Lorgar in person and forced the entire Wordbearers' Legion to kneel in the ashes of what they had built. The Emperor told Lorgar, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that he was not a god, that the worship Lorgar offered was not merely unwanted, but actively harmful to the Emperor's vision for humanity, that the time the Wordbearers had spent building temples and converting populations to the Emperor's worship had been time wasted, time that should have been spent conquering new worlds and advancing the crusade. Lorgar was humiliated. His legion was humiliated. And the wound that was inflicted that day would never heal. In his despair, Lorgar went searching for gods that would actually accept his worship. And he found them. On a pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror, while guided by his chaplain Erebus and his captain Corpheron, Lorgar encountered the Chaos Gods. And unlike the Emperor, they welcomed his devotion. They showed him what they called the primordial truth, the reality of the warp and the entities that dwelt within it. They told him that gods were real, that the spiritual dimension his father had denied was not only genuine, but was the fundamental truth underlying all of reality. Lorgar was the first Primarch to fall to chaos, and he would not be the last. While Lorgar's corruption was the seed from which the heresy grew, the soil that allowed it to take root was the discontent and resentment that had been building among the Primarchs for years. The Emperor's decision to leave the crusade and return to Terra was a significant contributing factor. His refusal to explain what he was doing on Terra bred mistrust. The Primarchs felt abandoned by their father, left to fight and die in his name, while he pursued mysterious objectives behind closed doors. What the Emperor was actually doing on Terra was working on the Imperial Webway project. He had discovered the Golden Throne, an ancient device dating back to at least the Dark Age of technology, which had the potential to open a gateway into the Elder Webway, a vast network of tunnels through an extra-dimensional space that allowed instantaneous travel between points across the galaxy without passing through the warp. If the Emperor could gain access to this network and expand it for human use, it would revolutionize interstellar travel. Humanity would no longer need to risk the dangers of warp travel. Ships could move from one end of the galaxy to the other in moments, without ever exposing their crews to the horrors of the Imperium. The implications went far beyond mere convenience. Without the need for warp travel, the Astronomicon would become less critical. The navigator houses, who held a monopoly on guiding ships through the warp, would lose their stranglehold on interstellar commerce. And most importantly, humanity's dependence on anything connected to the warp would be dramatically reduced, weakening the Chaos Gods by cutting off one of their primary avenues of influence over the material universe. It was, in every sense, the Emperor's master plan. The Great Crusade was never the endgame. It was a means of reunifying humanity so that the Webway project could serve its intended purpose. The conquered worlds, the Space Marine legions, the Astronomicon, all of it was infrastructure for this final, transformative step that would secure humanity's future and begin the slow strangulation of the Chaos Gods. But the project required the Emperor's personal attention. The Golden Throne needed his psychic power to operate, and so he retreated to the deepest dungeons of the Imperial Palace, sat upon the throne, and poured his mind into the delicate work of forcing open a pathway into the Webway. He told no one what he was doing, not the Primarchs, not Horus, not even Malcador, until circumstances forced his hand. The Emperor, who had always operated on a level of strategic thinking that was incomprehensible to ordinary minds, seemed genuinely unable to understand why his sons would interpret his silence as rejection. He was saving humanity. What else could possibly matter? The Emperor also made another decision that deepened the rift between himself and his Primarchs. He established the Council of Terror, a body of mortal human administrators who would govern the Imperium in his absence. The Primarchs were not given seats on this council. They were generals, the Emperor seemed to be saying, not rulers. The business of governing the empire they had conquered was to be handled by bureaucrats and administrators, not demigods. For beings who had spent their entire lives fighting and bleeding for the Imperium, this was a profound insult. The Primarchs had conquered the galaxy with their bare hands, and now ordinary humans, people who had never seen a battlefield or felt the weight of command, were being placed above them in the hierarchy of power. The resentment was deep, and it was widespread, and it was exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that the Chaos Gods had been waiting to exploit. Lorgar and his word-bearers spent the remaining years of the Great Crusade secretly working to corrupt the other legions. Their primary agent was First Chaplain Erebus, a manipulative and thoroughly evil individual who had been one of the first word-bearers to embrace chaos. Erebus moved among the other legions like a serpent, whispering doubts and grievances, establishing warrior lodges, secret societies within the legions where dissatisfied space marines could gather and speak freely about their concerns without the oversight of their commanding officers. These lodges became the primary vectors for the spread of chaos corruption. Within their closed meetings, the seeds of heresy were planted and nurtured. Her marines who felt overlooked, disrespected, or confused by the Emperor's decisions found sympathetic ears and compelling arguments for why the current order of things was unjust. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the poison spread. The tipping point came on the moon of Davin. Horus, the War Master, was leading a campaign against a rebellion on the world of Davin when he was struck down by a weapon tainted with chaos energy, a blade called the Anathem. The wound was mortal. Conventional medicine could not save him. And so, at the urging of Erebus, Horus was taken to a temple of the Serpent Lodge, a chaos cult that had been operating on Davin under the noses of imperial authorities. What happened in that temple changed the galaxy forever. During a dark ritual, Horus's consciousness was projected into the warp. There, he was shown visions. He carefully crafted by the Chaos Gods and presented as prophetic truth. He saw the future, a future where the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne as a god, worshipped by trillions of fanatical believers. He saw himself and his brothers forgotten, their sacrifices unremembered, their names erased from history, while ordinary humans knelt before the Emperor's divine image. He saw the Imperium become exactly the kind of oppressive, superstitious theocracy that the Emperor had always claimed to oppose. The irony is that the vision was, in many ways, accurate. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is very much the nightmare state that Horus was shown. But the Chaos Gods neglected to mention that it was Horus's own betrayal that would create this future. That the very act of turning against the Emperor would shatter the dream of an enlightened or rational civilization and leave behind only the wreckage that the Imperium would become. Horus was shown a future he himself would cause, and was manipulated into causing it by beings who presented themselves as his allies against that future. Horus emerged from the ritual changed. The resentment he had felt toward the Emperor, the hurt of being left behind while his father pursued secret projects, the burden of command that sometimes felt like it was crushing him, all of it was amplified 1,000-fold by the Chaos God's manipulation. And alongside that amplified resentment came new convictions. The Emperor was a tyrant. The Emperor was a liar. The Emperor intended to abandon his sons and ascend to godhood on the backs of their sacrifices. And Horus, the War Master, was the only one who could stop him. But the corruption of Horus was not instantaneous. It was a process, a gradual tightening of chains that the War Master did not realize were being placed around his soul until it was far too late to break free. But once the tipping point was reached, events accelerated with terrifying speed. Horus began to recruit allies among his brother Primarchs. Angron of the World Eaters, whose brain implants had turned him into an engine of rage that could barely think beyond the next battle, was easily swayed. Mortarion of the Death Guard, who nursed a deep personal grudge against the Emperor for the manner in which he had been rescued from his adoptive homeworld, joined as well. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children was seduced by the promises of perfection offered by Slanesh. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, a bitter and resentful after decades of thankless siege warfare, threw in his lot with the rebels. Conrad Kersey of the Night Lords, who had always known he was destined for darkness, needed little convincing. And Alpharius Omegon of the Alpha Legion joined for reasons so inscrutable that to this day, no one is entirely certain which side they were truly on. The opening blow of the heresy fell on Istvan III. Horus, having gathered his core of traitor legions, ordered the virus bombing of the planet's surface, annihilating the loyalist elements within his own forces, who he knew would never join his rebellion. Billions of people on the planet's surface died in minutes as the Life-Eater virus dissolved every organic molecule it touched. As the atmosphere itself ignited in a planet-wide firestorm, as the combustible gases released by the dissolved biomass were set alight, the few loyalist space marines who survived the bombardment were hunted down and killed in bitter ground fighting. It was brother against brother, sons of the same gene father murdering each other in the ruins of a world they had reduced to ash. The heresy had begun. The drop site massacre on Istvan V followed shortly after. The Emperor, upon learning of Horus's betrayal, dispatched 7 legions to bring the traitors to justice. But Horus had anticipated this. 4 of the 7 legions sent to Istvan V were secretly traitors themselves. The loyalist forces of the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands landed on the planet's surface and engaged the rebels, only to be attacked from behind by their supposed allies. The slaughter was nearly total. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was beheaded by Fulgrim. The Raven Guard and Salamanders were shattered, reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The drop site ran red with the blood of loyal warriors cut down by brothers they had trusted. The galaxy was now engulfed in civil war on a scale that defied comprehension. Horus marched on Terra at the head of 9 traitor legions, supported by elements of the Imperial army, the Dark Mechanicum, corrupted Titan legions, and the demons of chaos itself. Entire sectors burned. Worlds that had been part of the Imperium for barely a generation were torn apart by the fighting. The loyalist legions that had not been destroyed at Istvan struggled to regroup and respond, and hampered by the vast distances involved and the disruption of warp travel caused by the growing influence of chaos. 7 years of bitter, grinding war followed. 7 years in which the galaxy bled from one end to the other. 7 years in which the Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, unable to leave, because the Webway project had been catastrophically compromised. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, had inadvertently destroyed the Emperor's work. Learning of Horus's treachery through his psychic powers, Magnus had attempted to send a warning to the Emperor using a powerful spell that smashed through the psychic wards protecting the webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. The breach allowed demons to flood into the human-constructed portions of the webway. He's slaughtering thousands of workers and forcing the Custodes and Sisters of Silence into a desperate holding action. The Emperor was forced to sit upon the golden throne and use his psychic might to hold the breach closed, or Terra itself would be overrun by demons pouring through the portal. The war within the webway that followed was a campaign of unimaginable brutality, fought in an environment of unimaginable strangeness. The human-constructed sections of the webway had been enormous, vast tunnels and chambers designed to accommodate entire armies and civilian populations. Now they were infested with demons, their walls pulsing with warp energy, their corridors echoing with the laughter and screaming of entities that existed to destroy. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence fought there for what felt like years, holding the line against an enemy that was literally infinite, because demons that were destroyed simply reformed in the warp and attacked again. The Emperor's own psychic power was the only thing preventing the breach from widening to the point where nothing could hold back the tide. During this conflict, the Sister of Silence, Carrier Kasrin, saw the Emperor for what he truly was beneath all the psychic glamour and divine imagery. She saw a simple man, no more or less, in perpetual agony upon the golden throne, his mouth open in a silent scream, the pain of his efforts seeming to age his ageless face. There was no golden halo, no psychic corona, just a man, suffering beyond comprehension, holding the door closed against a darkness that would consume everything if he let go for even an instant. Eventually, the Imperial forces were compelled to abandon the webway entirely. The demons were too many, the casualties too severe, the situation too hopeless. The portal was sealed shut, but only the Emperor's psychic power could keep it that way. The Webway Project, the great dream of a humanity freed from dependence on the warp, was dead. All those years of work, all that hope, all that potential, destroyed by a well-intentioned spell cast by a son who was only trying to help. The irony was excruciating. Magnus had been trying to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal, and in doing so, he had destroyed the Emperor's greatest project, trapped the most powerful being in the galaxy on a chair he could not leave, and ensured that the Emperor would not be able to take the field against the traitors until the very last moment, when everything else had already been lost. And there was one more addition to the horror. At the Emperor's direction, the Primarch Vulcan installed a device called the Talisman of Seven Hammers into the Golden Throne. This device functioned as a dead man's switch. If the Golden Throne ever failed completely, if the Emperor finally died and the Webway portal could no longer be held closed, the talisman would detonate. The resulting explosion would destroy not just the Imperial Palace, not just the continent it sat upon, but the entirety of Terra. The homeworld of humanity, the cradle of the species, the holiest site in the Imperium, would be obliterated, because the alternative, allowing demons to pour through the breach and claim Terra as a staging ground for the invasion of the material universe, was worse. And the Emperor had accepted that if all else failed, the destruction of everything he had built was preferable to its corruption. It was, perhaps, the most Emperor decision he ever made. The siege of Terra began when Horus's massive fleet emerged from the warp in the Sol system. For days, the traitor fleet fought its way through the system's outer defenses, smashing through Imperial naval forces and destroying the orbital stations and defensive platforms that had been erected to protect humanity's homeworld. Luna's naval bases were obliterated. Terra's orbital defenses were overwhelmed. Within 30 days of continuous space combat, the traitors had achieved orbital supremacy over Terra itself. The bombardment that followed shook the planet to its core. From orbit, Horus's ships poured fire onto the surface, targeting military installations, infrastructure, and population centers with equal ferocity. The atmosphere was thick with ash and debris. The sky burned with the light of falling munitions. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to rubble in hours. The civilians of Terra, billions of ordinary people who had never seen war and had only the vaguest understanding of why it was happening, huddled in shelters and prayed to the Emperor for salvation. Many of those prayers would go unanswered. The death toll from the orbital bombardment alone was measured in hundreds of millions. And through it all, the defenders of Terra held their ground. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, had been given overall command of Terra's defense. For years, he had been fortifying the Imperial Palace and the surrounding terrain, transforming the Emperor's seat of power into the most formidable defensive position in human history. Walls hundreds of meters thick, constructed from ferrocrete and adamantium and blessed by the rites of the Mechanicum. Void shield generators that could deflect orbital bombardment, their energy signatures painting the sky above the palace in shimmering auroras of displaced force. Gun emplacements that could shoot down incoming dropships. Macro cannon batteries that could engage targets in low orbit. Missile silos buried beneath meters of hardened earth. Trench networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, manned by millions of Imperial Army soldiers who knew that the ground they defended was the last ground that mattered. It was a masterwork of military engineering, as the culmination of Rogel Dawn's lifetime of expertise in defensive warfare, and it would need to be, because the forces arrayed against it were overwhelming. The traitor legions landed in force. World Eaters and Death Guard and Emperor's children and sons of Horus poured from their dropships, supported by corrupted Titan legions and vast hordes of cultists, mutants, and demons. The ground shook beneath the footsteps of war engines the size of buildings. The air screamed with the passage of munitions too numerous to count. The fighting was apocalyptic in the truest sense of the word, a conflict on a scale and of a ferocity that the universe had never seen before and would never see again. Entire sections of the palace wall were reduced to rubble by concentrated Titan fire, only for the defenders to seal the breaches with their own bodies, here fighting hand to hand in the shattered masonry against enemies who felt no pain and feared no death. Loyalist defenders fought and died by the tens of thousands, only to be replaced by fresh waves of soldiers who knew they were probably going to die too, but fought anyway because there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go, no alternative to victory that did not involve the extinction of everything they had ever known or loved. The Eternity Wall spaceport fell. The Lion's Gate spaceport fell. Angron, who had been elevated to demonhood by Khorne, led his World Eaters in a rampage that shattered Loyalist lines across an entire sector of the defense. Mortarian's Death Guard, bloated with Nurgle's blessings, advanced through chemical and biological attacks that reduced unprotected humans to puddles of disease slurry. The Thousand Suns, under Magnus the Red, who had now fully embraced chaos, attempted to breach the Imperial dungeon and attack the Emperor directly on the Golden Throne. Through it all, 3 Primarchs held the line. Rogel Dawn, unyielding as the walls he had built. Sanguinius, the Angel, whose brilliant white wings and golden armor became a beacon of hope for every defender who caught sight of him. And Jagatai Khan, the White Scar, whose lightning cavalry raids disrupted traitor supply lines and prevented the siege from tightening as quickly as Horus needed it to. But time was not on the Loyalists' side. The defenses were crumbling. Casualties were mounting at a rate that could not be sustained. And the Emperor remained on the Golden Throne, trapped by the need to hold the webway portal closed, unable to join the fight that was raging above him. And then came the news that changed everything. Horus learned that Loyalist reinforcements were approaching Terra. The Ultramarines under Reboot Gilliman had fought their way through the traitor blockade. The Dark Angels under Lion L. Johnson were closing in. The Space Wolves under Lehman Russ had evaded the Alpha Legion's attempts to delay them. If these fresh legions reached Terra, Horus's numerical advantage would evaporate. The siege would become unwinnable. Horus made his gamble. He lowered the void shields protecting his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. It was a deliberate invitation, a challenge thrown across the void to the one being in the galaxy who could end the war with a single stroke. "Come to me, Father. Let us finish this." The Emperor saw the opening and knew it was a trap. He also knew he had no choice. Malkador the Sigillite took his place on the Golden Throne, a burden that the second most powerful human psyker in the galaxy knew would kill him. The Emperor gathered his strike force. Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, elite Terminators from the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels legions, and a contingent of Custodian Guard. They teleported directly onto the Vengeful Spirit, and everything went wrong. The teleportation was disrupted by the chaos energies permeating the flagship. The strike force was scattered throughout the massive vessel, separated from each other and surrounded by enemies. Demons and Chaos Marines attacked from every direction. The Loyalists fought their way through corridors that had been twisted into nightmarish parodies of their original design, walls pulsing with organic growths, floors slick with blood, and less identifiable fluids. Sanguinius found Horus first. The Angel and the War Master faced each other in Horus's throne room, and for a moment, perhaps, there was still something human in Horus's eyes. He offered Sanguinius one last chance to join him. Sanguinius refused, and then they fought. It was not a contest. Horus, empowered by all four Chaos Gods and the terrible energies he had absorbed at Molech, was beyond anything a single Primarch could match. Sanguinius fought with everything he had, the purest expression of angelic fury the galaxy had ever seen, and it was not enough. Horus broke the Angel's back over his knee and cast his corpse aside like a discarded toy. When the Emperor finally reached Horus's throne room, he found his most beloved son standing over the broken body of his most beautiful son. Yet the sight struck the Emperor with a grief so profound that even his superhuman composure faltered. And Horus, seeing his father's pain, laughed. What followed was the single most important combat in the history of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Emperor fought Horus, and for the first time in the engagement, the Master of Mankind held back. He could not bring himself to use his full power against his favored son. Despite everything Horus had done, despite the millions of lives he had destroyed, despite the ruin he had brought upon the Imperium and the dream it represented, the Emperor still loved him, still hoped, against all reason and evidence, that some spark of the son he had known remained within the monster Horus had become. That hesitation nearly cost the Emperor everything, but Horus struck with the combined power of all four Chaos Gods, and the wounds he inflicted on the Emperor were catastrophic. The flesh was burned from his face, an eye was destroyed, an arm was torn from its socket, his spine was broken. The most powerful being in human history was beaten to the edge of annihilation by a son he had refused to fight with everything he had. The accounts vary on what finally broke the Emperor's restraint. Some say it was the sight of a lone custodian guard, or perhaps an ordinary human soldier, who stepped between the Emperor and Horus, and was instantly annihilated, obliterated so completely that not even atoms remained. The casual, contemptuous ease with which Horus destroyed this brave soul showed the Emperor, finally and irrevocably, that his son was gone. That the thing wearing Horus's face was not Horus. Not anymore. It was a puppet of the Chaos Gods, a vessel for their malice, and it would never, could never, be redeemed. And so the Emperor unleashed the full force of his psychic might. The blow that struck Horus was not merely physical, it was spiritual. It was a lance of pure, concentrated psychic energy that burned through every layer of chaos corruption, through the blessings of Khorne and Nurgle and Sench and Slanesh, through the demonic power that had sustained the War Master's superhuman abilities, through everything that was not Horus, until it reached the core of his being and annihilated it. The Chaos Gods, feeling the Emperor's power threatening to destroy their investment, withdrew from Horus in the instant before the killing blow landed, and in that brief, terrible moment of clarity, Horus saw what he had done, what he had become, what he had allowed himself to be used for. Sources differ on whether Horus expressed remorse in that final instant. Some say he wept. Some say he begged his father for forgiveness. Some say he simply looked at the Emperor with an expression of horrified understanding, the same expression a man might wear if he woke from a pleasant dream to find his hands covered in the blood of everyone he had ever loved. The Emperor killed his son, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with sorrow so deep it could drown stars. And when it was done, when Horus lay dead and the Chaos Gods screamed their fury across the warp, the Emperor collapsed beside the body of his fallen son, his own ruined body finally surrendering to the injuries Horus had inflicted. Rogel Dawn found them there, his father, broken beyond repair, his brothers, dead. The throne room, silent as a tomb. The war was over. The Imperium had survived, but the cost was beyond reckoning. Rogel Dawn carried the Emperor's shattered body back to the Imperial Palace. The Master of Mankind was still alive, but only barely. His physical form was ruined beyond the ability of any healer or any technology to repair. He was dying, and everyone who saw him knew it. On the Golden Throne, Malkador the Sigillite had paid the ultimate price for holding the device in the Emperor's absence. The second most powerful human psyker in the galaxy had been reduced to ash by the strain of controlling the throne and maintaining the Astronomicon. When dawn arrived with the Emperor, Malkador's remains crumbled to dust. The last remnants of a man who had served faithfully for thousands of years consumed by the device he had fought to keep functioning. The Emperor spoke his last words. What exactly he said has been the subject of intense debate and speculation for 10,000 years. Different sources report different final utterances, but the core of his message was consistent. He must be placed on the Golden Throne. The throne's technology, originally designed to facilitate the Webway project, must be repurposed as a life support system. His body must be sustained, because if he died, the Astronomicon would go dark, warp travel would become impossible, and the Imperium would fragment and perish. The Emperor was placed upon the Golden Throne. The device was hastily modified by tech priests working under Rogel Dawn's desperate supervision, while the machinery hummed to life, its ancient systems engaging with the Emperor's failing biology in a symbiosis that was part science, part mysticism, and part sheer desperation. The Emperor's body was stabilized. His mind, still impossibly powerful despite the ruin of his physical form, expanded outward into the warp to take up the burdens that would define his existence for the next 10,000 years. He would power the Astronomicon, guiding humanity's ships through the warp. He would maintain the psychic wards around Terra, holding back the demons that constantly pressed against the barrier. He would fight an endless war in the Imperium, battling the Chaos Gods on their own ground with nothing but the force of his will. And he would do all of this in a state of constant, unimaginable agony. But his consciousness stretched across the entire galaxy, his body slowly rotting away around him, his awareness fractured between 1,000 simultaneous tasks that would have destroyed any lesser mind in an instant. The Emperor became a prisoner of the Golden Throne, a prisoner of duty, a prisoner of the choices he had made across tens of thousands of years that had led, inevitably and inescapably, to this single, terrible point. The most powerful being in human history, reduced to a decaying corpse on a machine, kept alive by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 screaming psykers whose life force was fed into the throne to sustain what remained of the man who had once dreamed of leading humanity to the stars. The wars of the Great Scouring followed the siege of Terra. The Loyalist legions, led by the surviving Primarchs, each drove the traitors from their remaining positions in Imperial space. One by one, the heretic Astartes were pushed back, hounded from system after system, until they retreated into the Eye of Terror, a massive warp rift where the laws of physics ceased to apply and the power of the Chaos Gods held sway. There they would remain, licking their wounds and plotting their revenge for 10,000 years. The surviving Primarchs attempted to rebuild what had been broken, but the task was beyond even their capabilities. Robut Guilliman, the most administratively gifted of the Emperor's sons, assumed the role of Lord Commander of the Imperium and spent the next century restructuring the Empire's military and governmental institutions. He authored the Codex Astartes, which broke the Space Marine legions into smaller or more manageable chapters to prevent any single commander from ever again wielding the kind of power Horus had abused. He established the institutions that would govern the Imperium for the next 10 millennia. But one by one, the remaining Primarchs departed. Some vanished into the warp, like Leman Russ, who left on a mysterious quest with the promise that he would return in humanity's hour of greatest need. Others, like Rogel Dawn, were lost in battle, their fates uncertain. Vulcan disappeared, his location unknown. The Khan rode into the webway and never came back. Korax vanished into the Eye of Terror on a mission of vengeance. Gilliman himself was laid low by a poisoned blade wielded by his traitorous brother Fulgrim, his body placed in stasis on Macragge, frozen between life and death. Within a few centuries of the heresy's end, not a single Primarch remained active in the Imperium. The demigods who had built the Empire were gone, and the ordinary humans they had left behind were faced with the impossible task of running a galaxy-spanning civilization without the superhuman leaders it had been designed to require. The structural weaknesses of the Imperium became apparent almost immediately. Without the Emperor's direct guidance, and without the Primarchs to enforce his will, the various institutions of the Imperium began to drift apart, each one pursuing its own agenda and interpreting the Emperor's wishes in whatever way best suited its own interests. The Administratum, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that managed the day-to-day governance of the Imperium, grew ever more bloated and inefficient. Its labyrinthine hierarchies producing an organization so complex that it sometimes took centuries for a simple administrative directive to travel from one end of the empire to the other. The Mechanicum, now renamed the Adeptus Mechanicus, retreated further into the ritualistic maintenance of technology they no longer understood, treating machines as sacred objects and technical manuals as holy scripture. The Inquisition, established in the final days of the heresy to root out chaos corruption, grew into a terrifying instrument of repression that answered to no one and wielded the authority to condemn entire worlds to destruction on the suspicion of heresy. The military institutions that had won the Great Crusade were restructured and weakened to prevent another rebellion. The Space Marine legions were broken down into chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors each, ensuring that no single commander could ever again wield the kind of military force that Horus had turned against the Imperium. The Imperial Guard, successor to the Imperial Army, was organized so that its ground forces and naval forces were commanded by separate and often competing hierarchies, a deliberate inefficiency designed to make coordinated rebellion impossible, but which also made coordinated defense significantly more difficult. The result was an empire that was powerful in aggregate, but dysfunctional in practice. A civilization that could mobilize millions of soldiers for a single campaign, but could not agree on who should command them. That possessed weapons capable of destroying worlds, but often lacked the bureaucratic authority to deploy them in time to matter. The Imperium survived not because it was well governed, but because it was so vast and so heavily armed that its enemies could not destroy it faster than it could blunder its way to some approximation of a response. And through it all, the one constant was faith. They did what humans always do when faced with the incomprehensible. They turned to faith. The Emperor had spent thousands of years fighting against religion. He had burned churches and executed priests. He had declared, repeatedly and emphatically, that there were no gods, and that superstition was humanity's greatest enemy. His doctrine of the imperial truth was explicitly aggressively atheist, and the future he envisioned for humanity was one of reason and science, where decisions were made based on evidence and logic rather than faith and fear. And yet, even during the Great Crusade, worship of the Emperor had taken root among the civilian population of the Imperium. A movement called the Lectitio Divinitatis had emerged, centered on the belief that the Emperor was, in fact, a divine being. The Emperor had forbidden this worship. His agents had suppressed it wherever they found it. But belief has a way of surviving persecution, especially when the object of that belief is a being of genuinely godlike power who has demonstrably performed miracles, conquered worlds, and created superhuman warriors from his own genetic material. After the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, the worship of him exploded across the Imperium. In the absence of the imperial truth's most powerful advocate, the human need for meaning and purpose and reassurance in the face of a hostile universe found its outlet in the deification of the man who had tried so hard to prevent exactly this from happening. The ecclesiarchy, or imperial cult, became the dominant religious institution in the Imperium. Its central tenets were simple. The Emperor is the one true God. To serve the Emperor is the highest duty. To die in the Emperor's name is the greatest honor. Heresy against the Emperor is punishable by death, and the Emperor protects. That last phrase, the Emperor protects, became the fundamental prayer of the Imperium. It is whispered by soldiers before battle and by mothers over their children's beds. It is carved into the walls of cathedrals and scratched into the hulls of warships. Thus, it is the first thing an imperial citizen learns and the last thing they say before they die. It is the beating heart of a civilization that spans 1,000,000 worlds, the unifying belief that holds together an empire so vast and so diverse that it would otherwise collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And the cruel irony, the beautiful, terrible irony that elevates the Emperor's story from tragedy to something approaching cosmic joke is that the worship may actually be working. The collective psychic energy generated by trillions upon trillions of believers pouring their faith toward a single point, the Golden Throne on Terra, has had measurable effects in the warp. The Emperor's psychic presence has grown stronger over the millennia, not weaker, despite the deterioration of his physical body. Now, some sources suggest that the Emperor is slowly, agonizingly, transforming into something that resembles the very god his people believe him to be. His consciousness evolving under the pressure of unimaginable psychic energy into an entity that exists as much in the warp as in the material world. The man who refused to be a god is becoming one whether he wants to or not. Created by the faith he tried to destroy. Sustained by the worship he explicitly forbade. The universe, it seems, has a sense of humor, and its jokes are not kind. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has endured, not thrived, not progressed, endured. It is a civilization in a state of permanent crisis, surrounded on all sides by enemies and rotting from within. But the bureaucracy that was supposed to maintain order has become a suffocating labyrinth of regulations and hierarchies, so complex that the simplest administrative decision can take decades to process. The technology that once made humanity the dominant species in the galaxy has stagnated, its maintenance reduced to ritual and superstition by tech priests who understand the prayers they chant over their machines, but not the science that makes those machines function. The military that once conquered the galaxy in the Emperor's name now fights a desperate holding action on every front, perpetually one step ahead of annihilation. And through it all, the Emperor sits on the Golden Throne, silent, suffering, sustaining. Every day, 1,000 psykers are sacrificed to keep the throne functioning, while their screams echo through the corridors of the Sanctum Imperialis, a sound so constant and so familiar that the custodian guard who protect the Emperor no longer hear it. The life force drained from these psykers feeds the Astronomicon, maintains the psychic wards around Terra, and keeps the Emperor's ruined body from finally surrendering to the death it has been denied for over 10,000 years. By the 36th millennium, the demands of the Golden Throne had grown. The tech priests who maintained the device, working through sacred rites they did not fully understand on technology they could not replicate, reported that the Emperor required more psychic energy to sustain the Astronomicon and his other vital functions. The Black Ships, of vessels dedicated to collecting psykers from across the Imperium and bringing them to Terra for sacrifice, increased in number and frequency. Some records suggest that by the 41st millennium, 4 times as many psykers were being sacrificed daily compared to the early centuries of the emperor's interment. The Golden Throne itself was failing. Slowly, incrementally, in ways that the Mechanicum's finest minds could diagnose but not repair. Components were degrading. Systems that had been ancient when the emperor first sat upon the throne were breaking down, and no one in the Imperium possessed the knowledge to fix them. The throne was a relic of the dark age of technology, built with techniques and materials that had been lost to humanity for millennia. Yet maintaining it was like trying to repair a quantum computer with a stone axe and good intentions. If the Golden Throne fails, the Emperor dies. If the Emperor dies, the Astronomicon goes dark. If the Astronomicon goes dark, warp travel becomes impossible. If warp travel becomes impossible, the Imperium shatters into a million isolated fragments, each one vulnerable to the enemies that press in from every direction. The entire edifice of human civilization, a million worlds and trillions upon trillions of souls, hangs by a thread. And that thread is a dying machine sustaining a dying god in the basement of a palace the size of a continent. Then came the events that shattered the galaxy. In approximately 999 of the 41st millennium, the 13th and final Black Crusade launched by Abaddon the Despoiler, a Warmaster of Chaos and successor to Horus, succeeded where all previous crusades had failed. The fortress world of Cadia, the most important defensive position guarding the Eye of Terror, was destroyed. The Cadian pylons, ancient devices of Necron origin that had helped suppress the warp's influence in the region, were shattered, and with their destruction, the dam broke. The Great Rift, known in High Gothic as the Cicatrix Maledictum, tore open across the galaxy like a wound in the fabric of reality itself. A galaxy-spanning chain of warp storms, it effectively split the Imperium in half. Worlds on one side of the rift, the side closest to Terra, could still receive the light of the Astronomicon and maintain some semblance of communication and travel. Worlds on the other side, in the region that became known as the Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, were cut off entirely, plunged into darkness and isolation, each one left to fend for itself against whatever horrors lurked in its particular corner of space. It was the single greatest catastrophe to befall the Imperium since the Horus heresy itself. Entire sectors were overrun by demons pouring through the rift. Worlds that had been stable and loyal for millennia were suddenly engulfed in chaos corruption. The forces of the Imperium, already stretched to the breaking point, were overwhelmed on virtually every front simultaneously. And then, in humanity's darkest hour, a miracle occurred. Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the son of the Emperor who had lain in stasis for 10,000 years, was resurrected. But the details of how this was accomplished are a story in themselves. The Archmagos Belisarius Call, an ancient and brilliant tech priest who had been working on a secret project for 10 millennia at Guilliman's own instructions before his incapacitation, had developed a means of healing the Primarch using a combination of Imperial technology and Eldar sorcery channeled through Ivrain, a leader of the Inari, followers of the nascent Eldar god of the dead. It was an alliance that would have been unthinkable in any other circumstances, humans and aliens working together using a fusion of science and what the Imperium would normally call heresy to bring back a demigod from the edge of death. Guilliman awoke to a galaxy he barely recognized, the Imperium he had helped build, and the civilization he had spent a century restructuring after the heresy had become something that would have horrified the Emperor. It was a theocratic nightmare, ruled by fear and superstition, its population kept in line by ignorance and the constant threat of violence. The imperial truth was dead. Science had been replaced by ritual. Progress had been replaced by tradition. And the Emperor, the man who had dreamed of a rational, enlightened civilization, was worshipped as a god by people who would burn you alive for suggesting otherwise. Guilliman fought his way to Terra through a galaxy in flames. He battled chaos forces, survived assassination attempts, and navigated the political nightmares of an Imperium that was simultaneously overjoyed at his return and terrified of the changes he might bring. When he finally arrived at the imperial palace and descended into the Sanctum Imperialis to stand before the golden throne, he came face to face with what remained of his father for the first time in over 10,000 years. What passed between father and son in that meeting is not fully known. The accounts that exist describe the emperor's communication as cold, distant, and almost alien. After 10 millennia of suffering on the golden throne, after 10,000 years of fighting the chaos gods in the warp, while simultaneously sustaining the Astronomicon and protecting the psychic integrity of Terra, whatever remained of the emperor's original personality had been compressed and distorted into something that bore little resemblance to the man who had once walked among his sons. Guilliman perceived not warmth or fatherly affection, but a crushing, overwhelming weight of purpose and duty that left no room for sentiment. Some accounts suggest that Guilliman emerged from the meeting deeply shaken, that what he had experienced in the emperor's presence was not the reunion of a loving father and a devoted son, but a transaction between a tool and the hand that wielded it. That the emperor saw Guilliman not as a son to be embraced, but as a resource to be deployed, a functional component in the machinery of the Imperium that had finally been repaired and put back into service. Whether this interpretation is accurate, or whether it reflects the limitations of even a Primarch's ability to comprehend a being as vast and alien as the Emperor has become, is left deliberately ambiguous. But what is certain is that Guilliman emerged from the meeting with a new determination, yet he declared himself Lord Commander of the Imperium once more, and Imperial Regent, the living hand of the Emperor, and he set about the monumental task of saving what could be saved. Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign designed to reclaim the worlds that had been lost or isolated by the Great Rift. He deployed Belisarius Caul's new creation, the Primaris Space Marines, an improved breed of superhuman warriors, bigger and more powerful than their predecessors, designed from a genetic template that Caul had been perfecting for 10,000 years. He reformed imperial institutions, streamlined bureaucratic processes, and attempted to bring something resembling competent governance back to a civilization that had been running on autopilot for millennia. But for all his efforts, Guilliman cannot turn back the clock. The Imperium is what it is. The Emperor's dream of a rational, enlightened civilization died on the deck of the Vengeful Spirit 10,000 years ago, and nothing Guilliman does can resurrect it. The best he can hope for is to hold together what remains and buy time for a future that may never come. And on the golden throne, the Emperor endures. Still suffering, still sustaining, still trapped in the machine that was supposed to be humanity's salvation and instead became his prison. The most powerful being in human history, reduced to a life support system for a civilization that worships him as a god he never wanted to be, sustained by sacrifices he never asked for, fighting battles in the warp that no one else can see, holding together an empire that is slowly, inexorably crumbling around him. The Rise of the Emperor is a story of hope, of a being of extraordinary power and vision who dared to dream of a better future for his species, who built armies and conquered worlds and created demigods in pursuit of a goal so ambitious it made the conquest of the galaxy look like a preliminary step, who believed that humanity could be more than it was, could transcend its limitations and achieve something approaching greatness among the stars. The fall of the Emperor is a story of how those dreams were destroyed, by the very sons he created to fulfill them, by the very forces he sought to defeat, by the very weaknesses in himself and his creations that he failed to see or chose to ignore, by the crushing, inescapable weight of a universe that seems to punish ambition and reward stagnation, that tears down golden ages and builds dark ones from their rubble. And the Emperor's current existence, trapped between life and death on the golden throne, is the story of the price that is paid for both the dream and its destruction. A price measured in suffering that has lasted for 10,000 years and shows no sign of ending. A price paid not just by the Emperor himself, but by the thousand psykers who are sacrificed to the throne every day, by the billions of soldiers who die in his name on battlefields across the galaxy, by the trillions of citizens who live and die in an Imperium that has become the very thing its founder fought to prevent. The Emperor protects, they say. And maybe he does. As maybe the psychic light of the Astronomicon that guides humanity's ships through the darkness is proof enough that somewhere within that rotting shell on the Golden Throne, something still cares about the species it was born to guide. Maybe the saints and miracles that Imperial citizens report, the moments of divine intervention that turn the tide of battles and save worlds from destruction, are evidence of a consciousness that still watches over its children despite everything they have become. Or maybe the Emperor is simply too stubborn to die, too committed to his duty to stop, too much a prisoner of his own choices to do anything other than endure, century after century, millennium after millennium, waiting for a future he can see but cannot reach. The rise and fall of the Emperor is the story of Warhammer 40,000. Every war fought in the 41st millennium and beyond is a consequence of his choices. Every space marine who charges into battle screaming for the Emperor is a living echo of his genetic legacy. Every cathedral raised in his honor and every psyker sacrificed to the Golden Throne is a monument to both his triumph and his failure. He is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the golden promise and the bitter reality. And somewhere, deep within the Sanctum Imperialis, beneath the mountains that have stood since before human civilization began, the most powerful being in the history of our species sits on his throne of gold and suffering, holding the galaxy together with nothing but his pain and his will and the fading memory of a dream that died 10,000 years ago. The Emperor protects, but no one protects the Emperor. And that, friends, is the story of the rise and fall of the Emperor of mankind. A story 48,000 years in the making, give or take, and still very much unfinished. There are theories about what happens next. The Star Child hypothesis suggests that the Emperor may one day be reborn as a true god of the warp, a being of pure psychic order to counter the chaos of the dark gods. The Terminus Decree, a sealed document left by the Emperor himself in the care of the Grey Knights, supposedly contains final instructions to be opened only in the most extreme circumstances, though what those instructions contain is unknown. Some believe it is the order to finally end the Emperor's suffering and allow him to die, trusting that whatever follows will be better than the slow decay of the current status quo. Whatever the future holds, the story of the Emperor is a reminder of something fundamental about the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Beneath all the bolters and chainswords and power armor, beneath the demon princes and the hive fleets and the Necron tomb worlds, this is a story about what happens when the best of intentions meet the worst of circumstances, about how the road to a golden age can lead straight through hell, about how the greatest tragedy is not the evil that destroys us from without, but the flaws within ourselves that we refuse to see until it is too late to change them. Consider for a moment the full scope of the Emperor's failures, because they are as instructive as his triumphs. He created the Thunder Warriors and then discarded them when they were no longer useful. Establishing a pattern of disposability that his Primarchs would later fear was their own destiny. He built the Primarchs with warp energy that made them susceptible to the very corruption he was trying to protect humanity from. He kept his Webway project secret from the sons who would have moved mountains to help him complete it, because he could not bring himself to share the full scope of his vision with anyone, not even the beings he had literally designed to be his confidants and commanders. He destroyed Monarchia and humiliated Lorgar, driving the most devout of his sons into the arms of the Chaos Gods. He created the Council of Terror and excluded the Primarchs from governance, making them feel like tools to be used and discarded rather than partners in a shared endeavor. Each of these decisions made sense from the Emperor's perspective. Each one was rational, even logical, when viewed through the lens of a being who was playing a game of cosmic chess against opponents who operated on a scale of time and power that dwarfed anything his sons could comprehend. But rationality is not the same thing as wisdom, and logic is not the same thing as empathy. The Emperor understood the galaxy, but he did not understand his children. He could foresee the movements of chaos across millennia of warp time, but he could not foresee that a son who was denied a father's love might seek that love from darker sources. He was, in the end, a being of such extraordinary intelligence and power that he could not comprehend the ordinary emotional needs of the creatures he had created, because those needs were rooted in a humanity he had transcended so long ago that he could no longer remember what it felt like. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of the Emperor's story. Not the betrayal, not the wounds, not the 10,000 years of suffering on the Golden Throne, but the simple, devastating fact that the most powerful being in human history was undone by a failing that any parent could have warned him about. You cannot raise children on duty alone. You cannot replace love with purpose. You cannot build loyalty on a foundation of pragmatism and expect it to survive the first real test. The Primarchs did not need a general. They needed a father. And the Emperor, for all his wisdom and power, could not be both. The Emperor was not a perfect being, but he was capable of extraordinary cruelty in pursuit of what he believed was the greater good. He was secretive when transparency might have prevented catastrophe. He was cold when warmth might have earned the loyalty that coercion could not guarantee. He treated his sons as tools when treating them as family might have saved everything. His failures were as vast as his ambitions, and the consequences of those failures have been paid in blood and suffering for 10,000 years. But he was also, for all his flaws, the only hope humanity had. The only being with the power and the vision to unite a fractured species and give it a fighting chance in a galaxy that was hostile beyond imagining. Without the Emperor, there would be no Imperium, no Astronomicon, no protection from the Chaos Gods. Humanity would have been consumed long ago, more ground to dust between the teeth of a universe that cares nothing for the survival of any species, least of all one as fragile and volatile as ours. The Emperor made mistakes. Terrible, catastrophic, galaxy-altering mistakes. But he also dared to dream on a scale that no one else could match. And if the dream died, if the golden future he envisioned was burned to ash by the fires of betrayal and hubris and the fundamental cruelty of a universe that does not want order or peace, at least it burned brightly enough for its light to last 10,000 years. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also a throne, and a man who will not die, and a light that, however dim, however fragile, however close it comes to going out forever, has not yet been extinguished. The Emperor protects, for now. Thank you so much for settling in with me tonight. If this journey through the Emperor's story resonated with you, if you felt something during the telling that made the grim darkness feel just a little more alive, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button and considered subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps this community grow, and it means we get to tell more stories like this one together. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the Emperor's story hits the hardest for you. Was it the betrayal at the Siege of Terror, the slow horror of his existence on the Golden Throne, or maybe the quiet tragedy of a man who fought against worship his entire life, only to become the most worshipped being in the galaxy? Whatever it is, I want to hear about it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, us in the darkness between the stars, where the laughter of thirsting gods echoes through eternity, there is still a light. It may be fading, it may be failing, but it is there, and for as long as it burns, there is still hope. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.